Worst case, forward reversals.
Okay.
Yeah.
How you doing? You want to sit in here?
Yeah, he does a lot of
Okay.
something like that. I think that's
So hi everybody, thanks for coming.
That's right. And he's in his brother's in.
Hi everybody, thanks for coming.
Right now. Whoa!
So I have a list of things to talk about this week, but kind of like last week, it will kind of flow with questions and input and all that stuff. So please feel free to ask questions. One of the reasons we're sitting in more circular style is because everyone's input's important, and it's nice to be able to make eye contact with each other. So if you have a question, probably not even putting your hand is necessary, just kind of throw in with a question.
Is that COVID laced?
First of all, so we talked about a couple of drills last week to kind of try during the week and things to think about in thermally. What did you guys try this week, or through this last week? Go ahead.
Figure 8 that you mentioned, if you get a small thermal.
Yeah.
On Wednesday, and it started from 1400 feet and it went all the way up to 2600 within 3 minutes.
Rad.
Thank you.
Nice. Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah. Yeah. So figure 8 works really well, right? Birds do it all the time, like we talked about last week, and it's a lot less committing when you have a mountain on one side, right? We can really kind of keep our trajectory away from the mountain with figure 8. So it works real well.
I'm unfamiliar with the figure 8. Could you explain?
Sure. Like when you know, a lot of times we do circles and lift,
Yeah.
like hawks and eagles and stuff do. But when a mountain's nearby, it's hard to judge what the downwind side, which is usually the mountain side, right? Because we're flying the windward facing mountains a lot. What the downwind side of that circle will look like, and if we drift more than anticipated on the downwind side, or if there's a combination of quite a bit of drift and some sink, we can get uncomfortably close to the ground.
Okay.
Right? So when the ground's an issue at all, we want to turn away from the ground. We can do that with figure 8s while still keeping it in the lift.
So that ends up looking more like a zigzag on the flight path.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Or even an 8. Yeah.
Well, I mean, as far as like as you're drifting up and sideways up the mountain, does it end up being, you know, figure 8?
We'll get to look at flight paths in a little bit. It's a good question, yeah. We'll get to look at flight paths, and like, for instance, this flight started with figure 8.
Okay,
So
excellent.
we'll get to see that. Good call. Any other thoughts on stuff we talked about last week and putting it into practice?
Tried the speed bar for the porpoise.
Oh, cool.
That was kind of fun.
Yeah.
I tried to do it going into the thermal. The only thing missing was the thermal, I thought.
Nice. Yeah, but so, you know, I remember when I was learning that, I got it wrong a couple times, and obviously it causes more pitch if you get it wrong. But then once you kind of learn it, it's fairly intuitive, right? Yeah. Cool.
You know, I saw something the other day, and I think it was with you. You were doing a tandem. Did you have a little kid
Yeah.
the other day?
Yeah.
Okay. So you did bigger ears, and you had to have been on speed bar, and you were not going down. You were actually, I was doing nothing, and you were staying at the same altitude that I was. So how did that work? I mean, you weren't in a thermal, you were going straight ahead. But, and so I don't know how
So
that works.
tandems have this really wide weight range, right? If I remember the numbers right off the top of my head, that tandem, the bottom of its weight range is 120 kilos, which like me with all the tandem gear, I'm at like 100, 105 kilos, right? So just like a few kilos more, and I'm in the weight range on that tandem glider. And then the top of the weight range is like 220, right? So I can take a really big person or a really small person. And when I have a really small person, right, I had a 10-year-old girl, however old she was, right, a really small person, she probably weighed 60 pounds, maybe less. It's, you know, I have a really good sink rate. I don't have that great of speed, right? I'm not going forward very fast, but it doesn't take much lift to go or not to go down. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, so one of the reasons I was doing big ears was because her dad was flying as well. And it was really tricky to stay at her dad's level. Right? We kept out climbing him, and he brought his daughter flying on her birthday, and as a pilot, and he wanted to fly next to her. So I was having to fly around on big ears a lot just to try to get down to him, and he was trying to rise up to me. So yeah, even with the big ears though, like our sink rate was probably about like a normal sink rate on a glider, just because she's such a small passenger.
Yeah, because I was like in amazement that it's like, I am not doing anything. And we're staying the same, so no,
Yeah.
okay.
Good observation there, guys.
What else did we talk about last week? What else did you guys think about through the week?
The other day when we flew Leavenworth, I made sure not to, I put the outside brake all the way up and keep it on the inside turn. And that worked a lot better as far as being able to hook the
Nice.
It was a little rowdy that day, so it was still kind of want to touch the outside, but yeah.
You know, through the week I got to do a couple of tandem flights with pilots, right? I was kind of training tandems thermally. And one thing I kept noticing through the week is when they had the brakes, and I actually reach out and just hold their outside hand up. Right? It's still communication pressure, but just higher than it was. All of a sudden you feel the glider just bite into that turn, right? And a lot of times when we're having a hard time turning the glider over, we're like, come on, turn, turn, turn. What you might find is that you're holding a lot more outside brake than necessary, and it's actually kind of you stopping the glider from carving around, or not helping the glider carve around, right? And we gave this caveat last week, but I'll repeat it. We want outside communication, right? The outside tip is an important part of the glider to feel for mapping the thermal and for safety, right? For not having collapses, deflations. But we don't want too much, right? And actually, as we have too much, we're taking away sensitivity, right? Because finesse is more sensitivity than like big, strong muscles. And it's gonna, that drag on the outside wing is gonna continue to kind of pull us out of this turn. Yeah, it's a really good point. Thanks for bringing that up. I see, one thing I talked about last week is kind of the pitch control. I think I talked about it with both speed bar and with brakes. And you know, talking about just, hey, if you have a flight and yesterday was a perfect day, right? In the evening it was sled rides, right? So what can you do with a sled ride to kind of train, right? You can come out over a box like we talked about, right? Lots of altitude, over a place where there's no one underneath you, there's no power lines underneath you, there's good terrain if you would have to throw your reserve. And you could do some, what we talked about last week was pitch control drills, right? Getting the glider to go into pitches, right? Obviously we start small and you can build up as competency builds. And then, come on in, yeah. So as we're actually getting the glider to pitch, we're pretty much doing the opposite thing as we would do in active air, right? You're literally kind of putting a little bit of brake on what's behind you and then letting your hands up and actually letting it shoot out, which, anyone try that and find it hard to do? Every time I'm doing pitches and letting the glider shoot out here and like go past my hand, I'm like, keep your hands up, Mitch, you're trying to do this, right? Yeah. We've trained ourselves very well not to let it do it. But so you do a couple of those, right, to get some pitch going. Once again, amplitude will vary with competency. And then once you get some pitch going, a good thing to do is let it get behind you, right? And this time you're actually doing the real thing, right? We're actually training. So come on in, good morning. So let it get behind you. Anytime the glider's behind you, hands are up, right? But what are we doing? We're anticipating the surge, right? We're anticipating that glider coming overhead, and you know we're going to want to check in with the brakes right when it's overhead, and then bring our hands back up, right? Anyone try that through the week? And how'd it go?
So I did it, and it was really fun to pitch, but then I was anticipating it surging forward and trying to stop in the middle, and it felt like it was kind of too easy, and so I was thinking I should maybe do more extreme pitches, because I was probably being too conservative mentally. So I was curious how extreme of a pitch is okay.
Well, I think feeling easy is a good sign, right? Because it's not terribly difficult, but it's like the repetition of doing it and it feeling easy just means you'll be able to do it and move in air without really having to think about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's what we're trying to train. So it should be easy. And you're absolutely right. If it's feeling easy at the amplitude you're doing it in, feel free to build bigger amplitude.
So how much is unsafe?
I have a question over there. What happens when you go too big?
Yeah, I think same question. Yeah, perfect. You know, I think Cody was telling me that Henzi during the SIVs was daring these guys to try to get collapses out of a pitch, right? And pretty. What's that? You got one?
You get a beer if you get a frontal.
Yeah.
And letting it go to frontal, good luck. Right? It gets to the point where if you don't check it, you're not present.
If you can see your label out there, it's probably gonna flutter out, yeah, and just hope you don't fall into it, but I heard of beer.
Wait. When you said you get a frontal during the pitch control, it's like good luck, meaning have your reserve in hand, or?
No.
During any maneuver.
It's hard to get into frontal, I think.
Okay.
Because there's so much energy and so much pressure that the likelihood of it frontaling means that you did something else wrong, right? Your timing was off, whether you're coming in or out of it, or you're not.
Okay.
But to let it go that far, you'll check it well before then.
Well,
Right? So it can go pretty far in front of you to the point where it's looking at you and you're just wondering how it's there. But because it has all that energy,
okay.
it works really well. And so,
Until it doesn't have the energy.
you know, to your question over there, how far can I go? You can basically take that farther than you're comfortable.
I was way too like safe, you know, and
Yeah.
it's like, oh, well, I'd like to do more, but
And that's the beauty of this exercise, right? Is it gives you the ability to slowly build it up. So the last time you went this far, next time go another foot, right? Don't take it all the way. But you'll find eventually that you'll get it so far, you're wondering, well, at what point will it ever frontal? And you won't get there.
And then if you did get there,
Huh?
when it frontals, what next?
Hands up.
Hands up.
Yeah.
So
Hands up
the
like
takeaway from this, that maneuver is a fairly safe thing to practice.
Yeah, and you get a beer if you get there too.
If you get all the way to the front.
Oh yeah, if you frontal and you can show the video, yeah, you get a beer.
There's the crux of the matter. You gotta have the video.
Or it didn't happen.
Exactly.
So, yeah, good job with those drills. I'm gonna add another drill kind of along the same lines for this week. It's somewhat similar, but just a little different. What it's gonna be is we're gonna work on asymmetric roll and pitch control. Okay? So we were doing symmetric pitch control, right? And we can do asymmetric roll and pitch control by doing, you know, basically pilot-induced oscillations, right? By turning back and forth, right? And I'm not saying do wingovers, right? Wingovers is actually like a pretty, it has the potential to be a very dangerous maneuver, right? So wingovers aren't like something to trifle with. You want to learn your glider's energy in a very good sense before you try big over the glider wingovers. Because you know, if you have very little energy and you get up here, we can see how that would go wrong, right? If you don't have enough energy to come back around, the glider falls into itself or into you. So no big over the top wingovers, but what I'm saying is get some turns going, feel that swing through. Whenever you're doing kind of side to side turns like this, it's actually the swing through where you want to have your hands pretty high and you want to let the glider have plenty of energy, because that's when you build energy for the next side of the turn, right? And kind of think of it as, yeah, just like kind of pilot-induced oscillation swing through turns. Once again, not saying anything like up over the glider, right? Not wingovers, more like oscillations. So kind of let this happen. Even just feeling these swings and the energy of your glider and what it takes to get from one side to another is a great thing to feel. And definitely have weight shift involved, right? And the moment you definitely want weight shift is as you're coming under the glider, right, which we call the 6 o'clock position, right? As you're coming under the glider, that's when you should have the weight shift on the other side, right? You can have the weight shift on the other side when you're at the beginning of the swing through, but it doesn't really affect the glider until you're at the bottom of it.
So you got some weight in the seat.
Yeah, exactly, until that G-force is actually in the seat again, yeah. So lean the other side, kind of doing a couple of those, and then you'll want to exit them and get the glider back to straight and level flight. Does that make sense? So you're dealing with this very 3D glider now, right? It's not just one dimension that you're affecting and dealing with. You have pitch, you have roll, and you have yaw, right? We've got the whole 3D sense of the glider that you're affecting. It's going to be the same thing, right? It's amplitude with competency, right? And most of us in this room aren't ready for over-the-top wingovers and shouldn't be doing them with competency, but that's the lots and lots of practice at this is what gives you that timing and that swing through and that energy management that gives you wingovers, right? But just start with little small turns, do a few of them, start to feel what it's like to really let the glider swing and come up and swing and come up, and then get it back to straight and level flight. Does that make sense? Right? And there'll be some weight shift with the recovery and some brake with the recovery. And same rules for where you do it, right? Lots of air under you. Think 1,000 feet at least of air under you, right? And if we're doing sled rides like last night and we're coming out over kind of like, let's say the bottom hillside here, right? Which is pretty nice reserve box, right? Those trees and stuff up there is a nice reserve box. You don't really want to be all the way where your drift would put you on the power lines and road and parking lot, right? Not such a nice reserve box, but up there, no one's underneath you again, right? We're doing those checks for every single time we ever do maneuvers. Lots of air, no one underneath you, good reserve box. And then, yeah, do it. And we're keeping them really mellow and building up nice and slowly and small and with our competency. And it does, once again, big wingovers aren't the point here. The point is to just learn how to deal with that 3D nature of your glider. And you'll feel when you get it straight and level back to normal flight really efficiently, you'll be like, oh, cool. You know, I did it well that time. Yeah. Any questions on that? Any thoughts? No? Sweet. So that's a good drill to have for this week. And then last week we also talked about like climbing in a thermal. Climbing in a thermal, let's say till the top of the thermal, gliding out of the thermal, and then coming back in. And you can even say, I'm going to come back in 300 feet lower than I left, right? And this gets you to practice looking at your instrument, think about glide ratio, think about distance away from the thermal, mentally kind of place that thermal in space out there and come back into it. Not super easy things, right? It kind of challenges each and every one of those things. And then, okay, did I come back in 300 feet under I left? Did I find the thermal again? Climb up again? Do it again, right? And on nights or days where there's multiple pilots up there, those thermals are marked out a little better, so it helps your mental mapping, right? And we talked a lot of it last week about thermaling with another pilot. I'll just go through this drill and then, yeah, so thank you. Mentally mapping it with another pilot. So, did anyone try that through this week?
You know,
Harder than it looks.
yeah.
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
Also, Mark and I were in a thermal once, and we were going around, and then, so how do you deal with, I felt, and I had the consistent beeps all the way up, and I was going pretty circular, and he was losing it, and so he was trying to go more oblong. So how do you deal with that when you're in the thermal at the same, you know, I mean, we were 180 degrees from each other for about 3 turns,
Nice.
and then he felt it would be better to go oblong, and I felt it was still great staying
Yeah.
circular. So how do you
So
you know.
First of all, it's pretty nice when you're mapping a thermal together like that. If one pilot does feel like, ooh, I have indications that there's a better core just a little bit next to us, right, or a better piece of it a little bit next to us, it's kind of nice for you as the pilot who's like established in this turn, because it gives you a wider map, right?
But we were still staying the same altitude.
Yeah,
He wasn't going
yeah.
up any faster, but he was losing it where I was for some reason. I don't know why, because my beat was
Yeah.
consistent, as was his.
And if you're
Going
staying at the
more
same
oblong.
altitude, his oblongness didn't really hurt him, right?
No,
Yeah.
however, when he came back in, we were no longer 180 degrees. And
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
how do you negotiate that
So-
between the two pilots? Or
Totally.
more?
So for the
Besides yelling at him once we land,
So for both pilots, it's kind of nice if I'm with Mark and he kind of searches out. It's kind of nice for me because I get to see what's going on over there, right?
Right.
And your evidence of what's going on over there was like, oh, same over there as here, right? There's not really a reason to extend the turn there. So a couple things could be the best thing to do, right? If the thermal is wider than you had originally suspected, a wider turn is going to give you a better climb rate. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So let's draw this out a little bit. Can everyone see the board on it? So, right, you guys were on this radius, right? And then Mark kind of, let's say you're doing left turns, Mark kind of went a little bit like this, something like that, right? And came back in, right? It's nice because all of a sudden you have this evidence of what's going on over there. And if Mark had been right, that there was like a much better piece of the thermal over there, you'd want to know that, right? And then you guys probably would have adjusted your circle to something like that. Does that make sense? But him showing it's the same might mean that this is the most efficient thing to do. Does that make sense? Because that will give us a flatter turn and therefore
More
Less
lift.
Lift, yeah.
yeah. More lift, more wing surface, a lower sink rate, right?
Okay.
Exactly. So that could have been the best adjustment to make there. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Now, let's say that Mark went over there and there is indication that it wasn't any better. Oh, this is still there. There's indication that it wasn't any better, okay? He went over there and descended a little bit, but he's still enough at your altitude like that you have to adjust for him to come back in. You also want Mark back in because it's good for your communication, right? It's good for your mental mapping.
Right.
So then what you might do, let's see if I can do two people at the same time here. Sorry, I'm kind of blocking some of you. So you were 180 degrees apart from each other, and then let's say the pen is Mark. Mark went out there, right? And he's coming back in. So here you have the decision to turn just a little tighter on this side to let him come in behind you.
Which is what I did.
Or you had the decision to follow him, but if he kind of went out and fell down, you don't follow him, right? You stick on your turn radius, and yeah, you probably turn just a little tighter so that he can come back in. And Mark might widen out his turn just a little bit so that you don't lose your mental map. Because also for Mark, one of the reasons he can go experiment like that is because he knows you're marking the climb, right? He's like, oh, okay, the pilot's in the climb, or marking the climb, or pilot in the climb is marking the climb. I'm gonna just go, I think there might be something out here. Okay, there's not. I can come right back to that circle. So it's for the best for both of you if you keep marking the climb and if he comes back into it.
And so because he maintained the same altitude that I was in, we both should have adjusted maybe to a wider circle, a bigger.
Yeah, a bigger circle should have given you a better overall sink rate. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And it should have gone up more. And then it could have only been for 50 feet that was the case, right? Like we said, like as the thermals go up, they might go like this, and yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
Okay, thanks.
Really good points. What was your question?
Back when you were talking about, marking, getting a mental map of your location in space, when you're up there, the only way I can think to do it is to look down and see what's below me, right? Is there any other ways that, other than, other pilots in the air, are there any other tricks that you use? And so you're flying by yourself.
There are a lot. Let's, it's kind of what we talked about for like an hour and a half last week.
Okay.
Sorry. So we're gonna move on this week.
Okay.
But
fair enough.
There is I haven't posted it yet. There's an edited video. Cody, it was awesome. It edited a video last week, and I actually right after this meeting I'll post it to my YouTube channel and share it, and you can catch up with that video. It's a really good question, and it's a really good question.
You've
We're
already
spending a bunch
covered
of
it.
time.
I'll watch the video.
Good question. Sweet. So we're talking about the thermal drill, talking about team flying. Anyone else? We talked about that a lot last week, right? About flying with someone else in the thermal and how it works and all that. Anyone else get some chances to try it or learn things about it? Feedback?
Like if you're flying together and you know each other, right? What if you're flying with somebody that you don't know, right?
Yeah.
And you don't have that kind of camaraderie, or you don't have that kind of information. Do you go out a little bit and search, or do you let them go out a little bit, or you wait, or do you try to stay closer to them?
The way to treat pretty much any fly, like anyone else in the air, is like a flying partner, right? Bird, glider, whatever. We fly so much better when we have evidence of what the other air is doing, what the air we're not in is doing, right? So the more people in the thermal, the better, right? that person being our teammate. A teammate is the way you want to think about it, right? You don't want to think like, oh, they're coming to my thermal and this is my thermal and now they're gonna kind of annoy me, right? And who, like, probably early in a lot of our thermal, we felt like that, right? Like, I finally had a thermal and now this other person's here and I got to deal with them, and it takes a lot of mental energy. But the fact is, they're helping you thermal, right? Once you learn how to use their evidence well, they're helping you thermal. So we should pretty much treat anyone we're thermaling with, bird, human, sailplane, whatever, as our teammate and work with them, right?
I always turn the same way birds do.
Yeah, me too. And sometimes they switch mid-turn. But yeah, it's a really good point. And guys, at the highest level competitions in the world, we act as teammates, right? Like, whatever, the best pilot from France, and the best pilot from the US, and the best pilot of Germany, we could all be thermally in the same thermal, and like, we're acting as teammates, because guess what? It helps to work as a team. We're gonna go faster through the course, we're gonna race better going as a team, and then in the last like 5 or 10K of the course, you gotta do something special, but or just come in with the team. Well, then you gotta try to be smarter than them. For most of the race, you're just trying to be as smart as them, you know? You're trying to just work with them. Yeah. Cool. I'm trying to think, did we talk about anything else last week that may have been good feedback to have after trying it for a week?
The upwind side of the thermals.
Upwind side of the thermal, yeah, really good point. Anyone kind of take some time visualizing the upwind side of the thermal stuff? What did you guys find?
Flying 3 seconds in the lift was pretty high, well, at least on Wednesday last week, it worked out really well.
Yeah. Is that the track you sent me? Did you send me a track? Yeah, cool. Nice.
In the one day it had a pretty strong wind, so that you could really feel it at a strong angle. That was nice.
Cody and I tandem. Cody's a very good pilot, so I'm not judging his piloting ability at all. But a couple times he looked back like, we're gonna turn sometime, Mitch? We're gonna turn sometime, Mitch? I was like, yeah, you just wait. And then we'd hit something stronger, right? Or if we didn't, hey, no big deal, it's right there, right? We're on the upwind side, we know it's right there, right? So, yeah. How about others of you who raised your hand thinking about the upwind?
So I felt actually it's much more consistent, and I tried to actually get ahead of it where it finishes, and then exactly like what you said, when they had searched for another thermal for another like 15, 20 seconds, couldn't find anything, came back to it and actually managed to go up another 300.
Nice, yeah. Awesome. Nice one. One thing we'll look at in the Avery is exactly that, is like what side of the thermal do people fall out on most often? And kind of one really nice thing about Avery is you can kind of visualize that, and it makes it a lot easier to see how you fell out of the thermal, right? Because when we're up there in space without any terrain features near us, it is really hard to say like, okay, I'm not thermal anymore, but where was I a second ago when I was, right? Am I on the upwind or downwind side, or what's going on? Did anyone like make progress this week in even just figuring out where upwind and downwind was?
Trying to look at the clouds and figure that out too, so
yeah,
that was good.
And
sometimes it's difficult.
Sometimes it's really difficult, right? Yeah. Sometimes it's really difficult, and you know, the information that's always accurate if you have a flight instrument is ground speed, right? GPS flight instrument, ground speed is the accurate information all the time. Who has like a wind calculator on their instrument, something that tells you velocity and direction of wind, right? That is not nearly as accurate as ground speed, right? What that's calculating is slightly different equations on the different instruments, but typically it's calculating what the drift of your last two 360s were, right? And does it know what kind of weight shift you're putting in? If you're flying egg-shaped circle, oblong circles, or if you're flying nice circles, right? It doesn't know any of that, right? All it says is, okay, this is the drift of the last two 360s, and therefore this is the wind, right? And especially if you were just thermally at 5,000 feet above the antennas, and you're like setting up to land, the last time you did 360s was at the antennas, like it doesn't know what the wind's doing down here, right? So while that number is kind of nice to be able to glance down and get an instant estimate of the wind direction and velocity, it's rarely completely accurate. Does that make sense? it's a pretty good estimate, and it's a nice thing to have down there, but get used to looking at that ground speed, right? And what the way looking at the ground speed works is, if you know that your trim speed is 38 kilometers an hour, right, or 23 miles an hour, something like that, and you're going 28 kilometers an hour or 16 miles an hour, right? You've got some sort of headwind, right? And if you did a little bit of turn this way and your speed increases, then this was more headwind than this. Does that make sense? And if you do a little turn this way and its speed increases again, then boom, that's the straight headwind. Does that make sense? And vice versa with tailwind, right? And within a thermal, you can look down at the instrument, and once again, it's a little bit more of an estimate, right? Because the thermal is somewhat different than the air around it. But typically the slowest speed you see on your ground speed as you're thermally around in a circle will be the headwind angle or just a few degrees past it. Because since we're in this bank and circling, sometimes you look down and then, so sometimes it's a few degrees before you looked. But so it works to glance down at your ground speed as you're circling in a thermal, and that will usually give you a decent wind direction, though maybe not velocity the best, since you're in that thermal. And it also works as you're on glide. And then you get to know your glider and say, okay, I'm on half speed bar. Usually I'd be going 50 kilometers an hour, let's say, and now I'm only going 45. So I've got some sort of 5K headwind component.
What's the lag time in GPS calculating ground speed?
Oh, there's no lag time.
0?
Yeah, perfect ground speed. Yeah, GPS. It's taking 1 second intervals. It's measuring the ground speed between them, and some of our GPSs are taking. That's just the track log points. No, it's a ground speed split. Yeah. And plane pilots, everything uses ground speed, and it's really good. Yeah, obviously, if for some reason you don't have at least 3 satellites, then it's not giving you. But then it just won't show up on there, or it'll just stay as a fixed number and not change. But if you have the satellites, then ground speed's perfect. Yeah. It's cool. You guys have any other questions on like instruments, things you're seeing on your instruments, stuff like that? While we're
I had glide ratio disappear on my flight.
Oh.
It went blank.
Oh.
What would cause that?
Did ground speed go away at the same time?
I can't recall.
Because glide ratio is a GPS thing. It's not a barometric pressure thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's using the GPS in your instrument.
Okay.
So that would make me think that you lost satellite. Was it on your phone?
No, Flymaster.
Oh, okay.
Well, it goes 3 dots when you're in lift, and you can no longer. It's like infinite glide ratio.
Oh, that's yeah. If you're
No.
left, it doesn't give you a glide ratio. Good point. Yeah. So you may have been going up.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, perfect.
I was just curious, man.
Now you know the answer, that's why.
I was under a cloud and I was just like, okay, what's going on?
That's a cheap function anyway. Come fly with the rest of us. Have to know, can I make it? No, I gotta turn around. Chicken out. We don't have that. How important is that then, like, to not chicken out? Do we need that? Like, should we upgrade stuff if we're doing cross country? And it's that point where I don't know if I can make it there. Does your glide ratio instrument, is it accurate enough that allows you to trust that you can go that far compared to just the visual that I've been doing for trying to know if my glide ratio.
So a few different questions in there. Let's kind of break it up, right? Do I have to buy this expensive GPS instrument, right? The like full featured flight instruments are kind of nice that integrate barometric software, Vario software with GPS stuff, right? And so they're kind of nice, but you can just have a barometric Vario that's working off pressure, like that's what Varios work off of, right? Some of them now are working off of G-force meters too. Am I saying that right? Yeah, accelerometer. So that they know if you're both in a turn, and going up as far as pressure goes. You can work with that and then just use your phone's GPS capabilities. Our phones have good GPS capabilities, right? The phones aren't worse than a high-tech flight instrument as far as GPS goes. Most of our phones are worse as far as the barometric sensor goes, right? So I wouldn't use your phone Now, maybe the latest model of phones, I'm a little wrong, and someone might say, hey, but the iPhone 11 has this barometer. I don't know, right? But for the most part, the phone's barometric sensor is not as good as what you'd buy in a nice flight instrument. So usually you'd want at least your phone and a barometric sensor. Yeah.
Is there something on the phone that will say your glide rate? Is there-
Yeah. So any app on your phone, it's an iPhone?
No, mine's.
So XC Track or XC Soar, those are the two big ones for Android. There's a few others too. But XC Track or XC Soar, XC Track seems to be the one they're updating the most
Yeah, I
often.
didn't know they had your glide rate.
Yeah, you can totally customize the screen and glide ratios right there.
Oh, cool,
Yeah.
okay.
And again, his question was,
Oh, yeah.
can you trust it?
Can you trust it?
Yeah.
So, as far, like, it is giving you a glide ratio this moment. What the air is doing between here and your objective, the instrument doesn't know, right? It doesn't know what kind of glide ratio you're gonna get ahead,
Or wind speed.
or wind speed or whatever, right? And like in comps, we'll have this like glide ratio necessary for goal function, right? Or height you'll arrive above goal, right? And then the instrument, and these are pretty high-end instruments that usually have them, and then the instrument is doing all these calculations. Okay, what kind of air has he been flying through the day? What kind of lift or sink? What kind of glide ratios through the day? What kind of headwind, tailwind components? What altitudes is he going through? Okay, he's going to end up 100 meters above goal, right? But they're wrong plenty. You go full speed, you try to get the 100 meters, you don't make it, you bomb out right before goal, right? So you usually want that number to be pretty big because for failure in the instrument. How do we see glide ratio? Like if I'm gonna make this next ridge, right? Let's say I just thermaled up above takeoff. I want to make it to the North Ridge, and usually when I glide to the North Ridge, guys, I want to make it at least on top of the ridge because the wind's coming up the other side. It's coming up the north side, right? So I don't want to be like down underneath the ridge on this side of the ridge, right? I want to make it at least over the ridge. So if I have this ridge in front of me, how do I know my current glide ratio? All I know is my current glide ratio, not necessarily what's ahead of me, is going to make it over that ridge.
Without instrument?
Yeah, without instrument, just myself.
Basing the relation of the top of the mountain to what can you see right behind it?
Yeah, and what these guys just said is up or down, right?
Yeah.
So if it's going down in my view, that means I'm going to overfly it. With my current glide ratio, things can change. I can get a bunch of sink, right? But I'm going to overfly it. If it's going up in my view, I'm going to end up underneath it, right? Yeah. So one thing, Damon, your track, one of your times at the North Ridge, you came back.
Yeah.
Right? He went like a lot of the way to the North Ridge, but then was like, I'm going to come back, which was awesome. Instead of just stuffing yourself behind it, getting a bunch of sink, and then you're not making it around the front, you might not make it back to takeoff, you're pretty much like trying to get to landing, right? If you get behind the North Ridge and don't get it. So instead, he was on that glide, and probably at first it looked pretty good. Yeah, at first it looked pretty good, and then he got a bunch of sink, and he retreated. He's like, nope, that wasn't the one. Retreated, got up again, went for it again. We're about to watch it soon, so hopefully I'm not. We can look at it. But went back again, and then got up on the North Ridge. Yeah. So I thought that was a really good thing and a really good thing for us all to watch, because it's amazing how much retreating will work sometimes. Yeah.
I have a question about getting to the North Ridge. Is there a way to approach it? I mean, you go right over the top of it, you go to one side or the other, where you can avoid that potential sink.
The best answer is it depends. The line's going to be slightly different every time.
Okay.
I do want to talk about, let's talk about horseshoes, right? Horseshoe glide paths. This is kind of like bumping around. You had a question that might be on subject, and then we'll talk about that.
Just a little bit earlier, you had mentioned that you were talking about variables and stuff. Like, they're really good instruments, but at what point do you trust your own senses over the instrument or the instrument over your own senses? Like, you have a ton of experience, right? So it's like, is there any situation where you'd be like, yeah, this is telling me something, I just don't feel it? Like, what's the clearest indicator that you would rather trust you over it?
So the things that, unless you have a malfunctioning instrument, But if like the GPS is malfunctioning, giving you a bad ground speed, it's just gonna be frozen in ground speed, it's not gonna give you a wrong number. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And either you have frozen ground speed or you have no ground speed showing, it's not gonna like give you a wrong number.
Mhm.
And if you're turning circles and the ground speed's just showing the same speed all the time, it's frozen, right? It's not working.
Gotcha.
But, so there's certain things that like the instrument's not gonna lie about. Ground speeds won't, right? The altimeter, it'd be very rare that it would lie about the altitude, it being set correctly, right? So like, if you're just working off a barometric altimeter, you have to zero in the altitude, or you have to calibrate in the altitude of takeoff, right? Before your flight. And if you haven't calibrated the altitude of takeoff, it could be like 300 feet wrong from takeoff, right? Depending on high pressure, low pressure, changes in pressure, right? But still, it's the relative change for the day is going to be accurate with a barometric altimeter, right? They're pretty simple instruments. The things that I might not trust perfectly are like the thermal dot on the Flymaster, right? That's the software doing work to say, hey, here's where the thermal is. And it doesn't necessarily anticipate like a thermal shifting over like this, right? So like if you're thermaling with someone else and the Flymaster says, hey, you're on the dot, but someone just a little bit over there is booming up, well, you go over there, right? Your observations are better than this dot on the Flymaster, and it's working off software to get that. It's not just a straight ground speed or altitude or something like that. And then same with that, like with that wind calibration, right? When it's telling you, hey, the wind is out of the southwest at 10 kilometers an hour, the instrument doesn't know that, right? The instrument, it makes some calculation based on your flight path, but it's not connected to your brakes and weight shift, right? It doesn't know what kind of flight path you're going for. So it's kind of knowing your instrument and knowing what things are like pretty hard and fast. It's hard for the instrument to tell you they're wrong, and what things are the software kind of trying to interpret, right? And the two big ones I'm thinking of right now is that wind speed and velocity. That's, like I said, very rarely perfectly accurate, right? But it's pretty often somewhat close if you've just done 2 360s. And the thermal marker, like the Flymaster has a little dot. A lot of the phone apps will show you your circles and give you red areas where you've been going up on your circles, or sometimes they'll give you like red bubbles in places and stuff like that. Each instrument's a little different with that stuff. But those like thermal trackers, they could be a little off because the thermals don't necessarily just go up in this nice beautiful column.
So I guess like when you're thermaling, are you more relying on your internal mental map more than anything else?
Yeah, and I'd really recommend, it's a really good point while we're talking about instruments, I'd recommend this is way more important than this. Does that make sense? Your observations of what are going on, you're flying your glider well, seeing that bird that's skying out over here, seeing the other pilot who's booming up over here, is way more important than following this tiny little dot on a tiny little screen, right? So think of it like driving a car. Most of us, when we drive a car, know our approximate speed, might even know like what gear we're in, what the tach's showing, whether we have half tank of fuel or low fuel. We'll know all that stuff. Someone in the passenger seat could ask us, and we wouldn't even have to really look down at it if we didn't, if we didn't want to. And we're still not going to hit the little kid who runs across the street, right? We're still going to stop before the little kid, right? So think of it the same way, right? You have this cool info right here, but you should organize the screen and have it simple enough so that it's glanced down to get the information you want, and most of your attention is out here.
Gotcha.
Yeah, really good question.
You ever carry redundant instruments?
Yeah, especially in comps, right? In competition, there's a chance one instrument will fail, and you need a redundant track, but also you need a redundant way to follow the task in the comp. So I won't have the exact same information on both, but I'll have like the basics on both. I'll have 2 screens in front of me, and the basics on both of what the task is, so I can hit all the waypoints and get the task done. When I'm free flying, more rarely, right? And I free fly a fair amount with no instruments at all, with no Vario and no GPS at all, because I think it's good training too, and I kind of like it. So, you know, for free flying, our instruments probably fail enough, seldom enough. That's probably okay. But for like competitions, when like, you know, I want a really good result, and I've traveled across the world to get there, and blowing one day could be blowing the whole comp, then yeah, I want to. Let's talk about horseshoe glide paths. I think it's a fairly interesting thing, and it's a cool theory. I'm not necessarily saying that going to the north is exactly a horseshoe glide path, okay? This question was about the North Ridge, and for a little while, let's just take the North Ridge out of it, because I don't think it's exactly the best example of this, but this is pretty good for other glide paths. I think the Issaquah Highlands, North Ridge to Issaquah Highlands, is an example of this. Okay, so let's use that. So we have a basic wind from this way, right? This is the I-90 corridor. This is North Ridge right here. North Ridge is right here, right? And Issaquah Highlands is right there. Okay? Wind direction is usually.
Where's Tiger North Launch?
Oh, North Launch is over here.
Oh, there you
Thank you. Yeah, right? About. Yeah.
Oh, copy. Heads up.
Ooh.
Right there. There's any more racks.
Since there is, there is some food outside on the table on the deck.
Thank you.
I should have put the
Just shake it and turn it upside down. Let people go along.
Do you guys mind just pressing, who has the keyboard? Let's press pause. Sorry about that. Cool. So.
Would you mind re-explaining just where everything is under?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So Lake Sammamish is here. Okay. I-90 is this freeway right here going into the mountains.
Oh.
Yeah, we have it approximately in there. Something like that. Right. The North Launch is right here.
No, the North Launch is there.
Sorry, North Launch is here. North Ridge is here.
Yeah.
Right. This is the North Ridge. It's very square. In this map.
Mitch, you got a fair picture right up on the.
Oh, boom! Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. You guys kind of get it here, so I can draw them. You get it?
So you have a west wind there, right? That's what it looks like.
Yeah. In general, the wind is coming to the mountains through the I-90 corridor, and because Squawk is here. We're kind of feeling it from Lake Sammamish. So basically this arrow is our normal wind direction, right? It's different sometimes, but this is, a lot of days are like this, right? Would you agree? Yeah, cool. So, you know, a lot of times into the North Ridge, the wind is kind of coming this way. And into Issaquah Highlands, it's kind of coming this way, right? Kind of that wind direction. Now, if I get up high on the North Ridge, right, it's awfully tempting to make a straight line towards Issaquah Highlands, right? The thing about that straight line is, and the typical thing with a ground flow wind, a valley wind, is that it's stronger and stronger the lower you get. Up high at cloud base, you might not be feeling that wind is strong, right? But then as you get more into the terrain where it's being funneled in and stuff, it's going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. It's fairly typical. Sometimes it's just a stronger cloud base. So to glide over to Issaquah Highlands, if I take a straight line at it, I'm going to be crabbing, right? The tip of the pen is my heading angle. I'm going to be crabbing like this across, right? So I'm going to have some headwind component the entire time, right? So I'm going to have a pretty crappy glide. Does that make sense? The other thing is here, since this is somewhat of a valley or a canyon, right? This is kind of low ground that the wind funnels into, right? These big features on it are going to cause like this kind of pillow of pressure behind them, right? Can you guys think of it? It's a bit of a venturi, right? So same thing happens between us and squawk, right? The wind pillows, 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 and then it venturis through, and usually we'll have more wind if you're setting up 100 feet over the landing zone here than if you're setting up 100 feet over Issaquah, right? Or if you go to Black Diamond, if you're setting up there, usually there'd be a little less wind than 100 feet over RLZ because we're in a venturi, right? The wind is squeezed through here, thumb on the garden hose principle, right? If you constrict a fluid in motion, it's going to increase in velocity. So instead of heading straight across to Issaquah Highlands, what usually makes pretty good sense, we might get the climb pretty high on the North Ridge. It makes sense to head out the North Ridge, which is a nice trigger line, right? Lots of thermals triggering, so you probably get a pretty good glide out. And the further out you get, the more this glide becomes either, so it's kind of more of a horseshoe shape, right? Becomes either a crosswind, and then you can actually almost use a tailwind coming into the feature. Does that make sense? Right? In this case, there's a little slant to the north wind, but in a lot of cases when we're flying mountains, the wind is coming straight into the mountains, so all the canyon features might have perpendicular wind to the mountains coming straight into them. Does that make sense? And you might use horseshoes on each and every one. So, think about crossing, once again, the tip is the way we're headed. Think about crossing with the crab angle, crab angle, crab angle, then guess what? If we get too low, we're kind of screwed, right? We got a headwind to buck, we're not getting to our triggers very high, and our only option is kind of like downwind to higher terrain. That's not going to work very well if we're already low, right? But if we do this, right, if we probably will stay nice and high, right? Good trigger line going out, and then we can come in. We're actually intercepting this good trigger line, right, where a lot of thermals might be really high because the terrain's low here, right? So say this is like the hospital, Cottage Hospital or something, right? The terrain's low there, and then if we don't get it there, we can keep going up and up and up at our leisure, right? If the terrain gets too high, we can just say, no, I'm going to stick around here, search for it, or land in one of these fields near the hospital or one of the parks or whatever it is. Does that make sense? So that's a horseshoe glide. It works really well at a lot of places where there's a venturi between two features. Right? What you don't want to do is get stuck low in this venturi, bucking the wind, and not really have a great option for retreating, and not really have a great option for going across. Yeah. The reason I said the move from takeoff to the North Ridge was different than that, why do you guys think it is? It's not a venturi, right? It's more of a bowl, and there's lift in the bowl a lot, right? So sometimes the North Ridge works like this, the move to the North Ridge works like this, where you can kind of treat it as a venturi and do a horseshoe, and it works pretty well. And sometimes it's just better to go straight, because you've got this bowl and rising air in the bowl the whole way. And then sometimes, if with enough altitude, it even works better to like go towards the towers and around, right? So the North Ridge has some options, and I wouldn't even say that it's the same best line every time. But in my experience at Issaquah Highlands, some sort of horseshoe seems to be the best line almost every time. Right? And the other cool thing about that is there are these little lakes right here, which are good trigger zones right in the middle of the valley. Right? There's like two little lakes right here next to the power lines that help you with the horseshoe. Yeah.
You have to do the same thing when you come back. We have enough altitude over there just to go draw a straight line.
I recommend it on the way back too, because now let's go. That's what it keeps. Are you guys seeing on the other screen too? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So here we are. You can see how I did it a little bit there, right? I went out forward on the trigger line, which was kind of pretty positive air a lot of the way out, and then kind of came back a little bit into it. It's not hugely defined. Yeah. Yeah, but and actually I didn't even go to the North Ridge for whatever reason. Just kind of went around and got a thermal off the lakes. But yeah, in the horseshoe pattern.
There are other people seeking out over the North Ridge.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Bunch of people showed us the North Ridge was crap.
Yep.
And then we got a really nice line a little bit further out.
Definitely.
This was Monday, Tuesday?
The 17th.
The 17th. So check this out about the North Ridge, right? This Issaquah is like big time heating zone, right? Lots of pavement and buildings and city stuff going on, big time heating zone, lots of stuff going on. And where is it gonna wanna trigger, right? We've got this first ridge right here, that change in topography right there is gonna be one place it triggers, right? Also, kind of like this ridge of Issaquah Highlands, another first change of topography, right? Kind of from flats to going up right outside the city. And then we've got another change in topography right at the beginning of the North Ridge, right? So if I'm going back, I'm often kind of going back a little bit like this and coming in. Here and there, I'll work this line here, but guess what? If you get sink and don't get it, all of a sudden you don't have landing zones, you know? You're just not in a very good place. I much prefer getting high, kind of working out a little bit. Usually this is a really buoyant line. Now I'm kind of pointing to where I'd be over the ground or where I think the thermals are triggering. This is a really buoyant line and then going up. And let's actually fast forward to where Cody and I, it just says Mitch, but Cody was my co-pilot on this one. Cody and I come back across. So we're right over the hospital here, right? And look what the wind sees going into Tiger Mountain, right? Look, the wind sees like this first ramp right here, right? And the wind is going to be kind of pushing all the heat in this big industrial area, or whatever, big cityscape, into this first ramp right here. Then there's another ramp right here. Then it all feeds right into the North Ridge and Tiger Mountain, right? So we're a little desperate here. Cody, why don't you talk a little bit?
No pressure.
So desperation is being nice. I would have been looking for an LZ at this point, right? But the idea being is that Mitch, you talked about you're always wanting to go into the wind, not into, you want to go downwind and float with it. But what you were saying was, let's drift with it a little bit, and I want to keep floating back towards the good stuff, towards these ridges where all that air is going to be going.
Yeah.
And you thought that it was going to get better as we went, instead of it getting worse like the barrier was telling us.
So we had on the way through to the north, sunny, nice here, beautiful cloud chute. We had climbed really nice. Then we came back, and it was all shady here, and there were like little bits of lift, but we weren't going up in it, right? We were kind of staying at zero with it. We had to find another plan because the shade was only staying, right? So now we're feeling lift, but in 5 minutes, maybe we can't even stay at the same altitude. So there was sun out here, so I pushed out here, and another reason for all this is what Cody just said is a really good point, is if in doubt, you want to be able to go downwind, right? When you get desperate, when you get to the lower third of the usable altitudes, right? If we split our usable altitudes into thirds, we can give ourselves certain rules with each third, right? And in the lower third, I just want to find anything that will keep me in the air, right? And if I've set myself upwind of good landing zones, if I haven't dug myself really deep with terrain right behind me, right? Then if I don't find a thermal, or if I find a really weak, crappy thermal that's just barely keeping me aloft, I can drift with it if I've got landing zones over there, right? But you see, if I've kind of put myself over a forest with no landing zones, I've got to use all my altitude just to get to a landing zone. If I put myself upwind of landing zones or in an area with, like from here, from that altitude, I can get all the Issaquah Highlands landing zones, right? I can get the school landing zones. I think I could probably even get to our landing zone here because it's mostly a downwind glide, right? So I've got all those options there as well as tons of triggers downwind of me. But if I had just posted myself into here, what do I have? right? Not much, like I'm landing a clear cut if I bomb out, and I'm gonna have to push upwind to a clear cut, right? So positioning yourself so you have nice landing zones means if you feel a little crappy piece of lift that's zeros, that's not going up but you're not going down in, you can drift with it. Drifting downwind takes us over more and more triggers, and probably that little crappy thermal is actually gonna get sucked into a big nice one, right? And I think that's what kind of happened.
Can you talk a little bit about there where we were drifting and the conversation we had about when you make the decision to look at your vario, because we were talking about instruments earlier, right? You know, the Flymaster has the little thermal map.
Yeah.
And do you trust your instincts or you trust that? Or do you look and see if you've fallen out of it? Because that was a fairly crappy piece of lift that we kept floating in and out of, up and down, you know, I think we were saying 30 feet. So can you talk a little bit about how that decision was made to continue float downwind with it and to keep that versus looking at the vario?
Totally. So, you know, a crappy little piece of lift that was keeping us in the game, right? We weren't landing. We had good landing zones in reach. And Cody kind of looks back at me and says, Mitch, how are you tracking this thing? Are you looking at the vario, the dot on the Flymaster? I said, well, no, I actually hadn't looked down at it, right? I was just kind of feeling it and staying in the game and having faith that it was going to drift us to a better climb. And I think he also asked, like, maybe about the diameter of circles, right? And at first when it was crappy, I was kind of doing pretty wide diameter circles for more searching power, and so I didn't have as much sink rate, right? Because if it's a crappy climb and you're really banked over, your glider has a lot of G-forces on it, so you don't get to feel these subtle little sensations, and you're just not flying through as much air, your circle's not as wide, right? So less sensation through your glider, not as wide a circle, and a higher sink rate when you're all banked over, right? So there's times to be nice and banked over, but when you're in this like little crappy thermal near the ground, we're hundreds of feet off the ground, but but when you're in this little crappy thermal, it's good to be nice and flat and really feel it out, because you might find that better piece of lift nearby. So that's what we were doing, and we were kind of like, if we felt a little bit of suck one way, we were kind of like feeling that out and letting the glider kind of give us good information and sometimes chase out some data. The other thing about being, maybe we're 300 feet off the ground, 400 maybe, about being 300 or 400 feet off the ground is you have a little bit better mapping, right? Because all of a sudden you actually do have reference points, right? So one good thing about low stage is you have good mental mapping. And then we got like a better core that was small but somewhat powerful, and I cranked it up in it, right?
Yeah. But you still drifted back towards the North Ridge, which is the direction you had identified we needed to head.
Yeah, so when we were out here, he's like, Mitch, what's your plan from here? Cody was being cool. He's interviewing it all, and we videoed a lot of it, so maybe he'll come with that video. But this is kind of like, I mean, look at this. Like, look, I went down with that circle. This circle, this was a 0, right? That's not going up or down. This was like 2 circles of barely, right? Not good, but keeping me in the game, right? At least these 3. That was a bad place to put a circle. But these 3, keeping me in the game, but not a good thermal, but just keeping me in the game, keeping us in the game. And then right there, boom, found it, right? Tightened up my core, tightened it up, and look, it's drifting me towards the North Ridge, which I had said back here. He's like, hey, what's your call here? I'm like, well, all this stuff should be triggering on this tree line over here, where that ridge goes down, and it should all be drifting us to the North Ridge. And if we can get a little bit of altitude and some drift, the North Ridge will be attainable. But from our altitude here, no chance of gliding over to the North Ridge, right? We just are out too low and not have a landing. But hey, we drift with just a little bit of a climb here, and we get up on our way there, and it's going to work.
You said this one's just a kind of beginner question, but you said it's triggering on this tree line. That word triggering.
Yeah, totally.
How are you visual? Would you explain that a little bit?
So I said triggering on this tree line, right? So kind of somewhere in here, right? Basically, huge area of heated up stuff, right? This whole like kind of lower Issaquah Highlands Plateau, right? Around Cottage Hospital there, right? Lots of big open fields, lots of parking lots around the hospital and other buildings and stuff. Lots of like good albedo value, right? Good ability for the ground to absorb the sun's energy, right? And enough protection and buildings and all that stuff that there's a pretty good ability for the ground to transfer the energy to the air, right? There's somewhat stagnant air on the ground because of all the buildings and stuff. Cities are really good for all that stuff going on because there's good albedo value and there's good protection from the wind, right? There's stagnant air on the surface. And so there's this big area heating up, but what the air typically does is it kind of like, it kind of like has some surface tension, so it heats up on the air, and then the wind will kind of drag it over a little bit, and it may trigger where there's a shade line, so that tree shade line could be a place it triggers. If there's like a cold creek right there, which is not, but a cold creek would be a trigger, right? Because think about shade, right? If we walk into the shade, the temperature's going to be 10 degrees cooler. So if the air there is 10 degrees cooler, that hot air, when it comes into contact with that cold air, has to go up.
So when you picture that warm air over that kind of the uncovered area in the sun, like, are you visualizing it kind of like a water droplet stuck to glass, like something
That's a good way to visualize it.
it's
Yeah.
still kind of stuck.
Yeah, yeah. And then like there might be a few places over here, which are the triggers, where it rises. So like when we're flying a mountain, a lot of people think of like the rocks that, you know, oh, there's a group of rocks there, that's where the thermal comes from. Well, that's where the thermal triggers. Does that make sense? And like when we fly over, man, I forget even the name for it, but from takeoff over to the right, the prominent point right there, Kingdom. When we fly over to the Kingdom, that thermal we get off the Kingdom isn't coming from like this little small piece of ground at the top of a hill that is all treed and stuff, right? There, of course, there's some heat coming from there, but really, it's coming from like all the stuff down below, flowing up through the ground, and then triggering as the hillside does these steps, and it's coming from very big sources of heat. Does that make sense? But the Kingdom is the trigger, is where that heat goes vertically, because it's such a prominent feature that things flowing up it have to kick off vertically from it, right? There's nowhere else for them to go. Does that make sense? So triggers are kind of like where that heat kicks off vertically.
So like when you say a trigger is like, oh, yeah, where it kicks off, like are you looking, when you're looking just for a trigger,
Yeah.
are you looking for a difference in?
Difference in temperature and topography, right? So like the cold creek, the shade line, that's temperature. The shade line's usually topography too, because there'll be a tree line or something, so the topography changes. And then when it comes to a mountain, the temperature can look about the same, right? About the same vegetation on the mountain, but when you see stuff like this, right? Like on those places or on the saddles, the heat's rising up, and then it gets to a ridge, and like it needs to just go vertically from the ridge. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good questions, yeah.
We use a cloud shade line the same way.
Cloud shade line, yeah, exactly. Cloud shade line's an awesome thing, yeah. So cloud shade line going across like a dry field, boom, it'll kick off. And sometimes we have to do a little math, right? If we're 5,000 feet over the ground and a cloud shade line passed 5 minutes ago, and the average climb rate that day, or average rate the air is climbing, is 700 feet a minute, it's like, well, how long did it take that cloud, the trigger from that cloud shade line to reach the altitude I'm going to arrive at? So it's okay if you're actually maybe 5 minutes after the shade passes through, right? Because you're kind of going into the past, right? The thermal you're in actually triggered off of what happened 5 minutes ago. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And I've had times where like I've scared elk through a field and they've released a trigger in the field, right?
Oh my.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Scare like horses or cattle on a field, they'll release a trigger. And it's worth like, if you see animals in your landing field, but you're still high enough to maybe put a last ditch effort, shadow bomb them, right? Run your shadow over the animals and scare them, right? And they might run around enough to get that like kind of whatever droplet of heat, whatever we want to call it, to trigger, right? A Jeep going through a field, that can all trigger because it's like some movement in there.
And that's all it takes.
Sometimes, yeah.
The sailplane pilot sometimes will dive the field and cut that.
Yeah, I've heard that too, yeah.
Break that surface tension.
Yeah. And sailplanes have enough residual energy that they can use all this speed to dive the field and then still climb up pretty high.
And then try to catch what
they just broke off. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Paragliders don't.
Or your buddy landing sometimes does it. You know, there's two of you, one person's 200 feet lower than the other. They land and they're like, okay, I'll see you down here. And you're like, no, you just triggered that field off. I'm out of here.
Thank you.
Yeah, you go ahead, I'll be ready.
Do you guys want a break? How are we doing? And some, you know, obviously, just like before, anytime you guys need to leave or whatever, it's not, no offense or anything. If you need to leave, you have to be somewhere. But I'm happy to talk longer.
I didn't need to leave, but I got my battery on your camera over there.
Okay, ask Cody about that.
Right now, but you know, 15, 30 minutes tops.
Should we take 5 to stretch legs and move a little bit and see the sun and look at the weather? Let's do that. Just
The sun.
give her energy or whatever. The weather.
Food and stuff.
Staring back at
Actually, you know what, I was just thinking about that. I'll leave my battery here, and my wife's at the hotel. We gotta check out, I gotta drive back to the church, but I can hop back in before we head out. So if you wanna just leave it sit around.
otherwise? I'm the one with the paragliding. There's not another Mitch Riley paragliding. I bet those two were.
You have?
There's a couple other Mitches. Well, there's a couple other Mitches. Cool, I was thinking of shifting a little bit to watching the dioramas and showing you guys want to get out of the dioramas. I wanted to just make one more point about this little instance here and kind of watch this play out. And then watch Damon's track. He sent me his track, and it's a really good one. And it'll be a cool one to kind of watch. And I'll try not to pick on you very much, but. Go for it, man. But yeah, we can get a lot of info from here that we don't really get after our flight. It's kind of part of that processing stage when you can use this tool. And just to remind everyone, I talked about it a little bit last week, but the easiest way to use this is to have an app running on your phone, whether it's XC Track, XC Soar for Android, or Fly Sky High for Apple. And you don't even have to have it on your deck. You can just have it in your pocket or whatever, and you can even have your phone in airplane mode, and it will still record a GPS track. Airplane mode with location turned on, and it will still record the GPS track, and it won't use much battery at all. Then it's really easy, like just through data network or Wi-Fi, just to drag and drop from your phone right onto here. If you have a flight instrument, it all works. But then you actually have to take the time to like plug it into a computer and do the file transfer and all that stuff. So it's just slightly more time consuming. Either one works. I kind of, if I remember to have my phone log in on takeoff, I find it much easier. Cool. And then I just log into here. You don't have to have an account. I do have an account, but you can just avery.com and just hit create your own. And the steps are super easy. It walks you right through it. It's not hard. Yeah. And I actually think it does ask you to sign in with your Facebook or Google account to Avery. And then it stores them all in the cloud for you for later. So the next time you sign in, you get to see the tracks you posted there. And there is something called a pro account. Some of you guys might know Mike Lester. He's a U.S. pilot who moved to Australia to work with Diorama and Avery. So he's working on this. And the pro account is them trying to make a profit, which is good. We don't want Avery to stop working. And that just means you can upload like more than 4 tracks at a time, which is kind of nice for seeing you flying with your buddies and stuff, or just other people. And it means you can also post photos during the track, so as the track plays, a cool photo would pop up and stuff like that. So I think the pro account's $5 a month. The free account, this works on the free account, what we're doing right here, so either way. One thing, we're kind of at the same point we were talking about this last time over the hospital. One thing I wanted to mention about like this crappy thermal that was pretty much just zeros. Remember, if I'm turning circles in zeros, the air is probably going up at like 300 feet a minute. Right? Straight line, we go down 240 feet a minute, 238 or something. So if I'm turning circles and not going down, the air is going up. It's a thermal, right? It's just not a thermal that's good enough to go up at. So remember, the stronger thermals are going to stand more vertically. The weaker ones are going to drift more. And the stronger ones kind of create this suction to them and suck in the weaker ones. So that's exactly what happened here, right? The fact that I was desperate, I was in the lower third, so was happy to turn in any zeros. The fact that I was turning in zeros meant the zero actually drifted me to this much better thermal. Right now my climb rate, let's just go back a little bit here. right there, my climb rate is 760 feet a minute. 314 or 760, yeah. 376, so good climb rate, right? And you can see in this diorama, we have everything right there. You can change the speed you're watching it. We're watching at 32 times speed. You can change the speed you're watching right here. You can go down to, real time speed, or you can go all the way up to 100 something times speed. Let's shift it into like 16 times speed, or maybe even 8 for us to watch this play out. So I went a little bit far off the down. Oh no, it's still pretty stacked. And then I changed my turn direction. I think Cody and I talked through that, and I didn't really lose that much climb rate. I think we felt like one side of the glider go up drastically. This is kind of a thing where more experienced pilots have a better ability to mentally map. So for a lot of us in this room, changing turn direction would throw out our mental maps so much that it's probably not worth it. It's probably better just to make that adjustment in a few turns. Does that make sense? But I change turn direction occasionally, and sometimes it works. Sometimes I screw up my mental map, and it's not a good thing. So yeah, sometimes you kind of want to know, okay, I'm watching a pretty advanced pilot, and they change turn direction. But that's okay for someone who has a lot of experience mentally mapping. So look, actually my turns got kind of crappy there, right? Maybe the change of direction wasn't good, but I'm still climbing pretty nice. And they're not badly stacked. Fair amount of wind, right?
Yeah.
We can see I'm really drifting there, drifting towards the north side. Ooh, boom. Climb rate just increased. There's a really good climb rate. Right? Now I'm dealing with 5, 6, sometimes 600 feet a minute, sometimes less. But once again, like that kind of drifted me into a better climb. Which drifted me into, better climb, lots of drifting. Guess what it's drifting me straight towards? The North Ridge. Right? And now I'm like, I'm over this terrain. So maybe my first trigger was there, and then the next time the thermal went steep was like there, and maybe like the next time it's going to go steep is here. And we're getting pretty high, 3,000 feet. And now, so the thermal ended, we're plenty high, and you just get the North Ridge, right? So it went from somewhere desperate and just kind of drifted with thermals to like a really good, easy place to be. And then pretty soon here, we're working to get underneath the 6,000 foot shelf of the Bravo. That's a really good climb. 900 feet a minute, 1,000 feet a minute.
Are you working the house?
Look, going straight at 700 feet a minute. Sweet.
Wow.
So this is where, getting out of the, getting to this side of the Class Bravo shelf. Yeah. And then we went downwind.
So did the sun break out again then during that crossover that allowed that?
Yeah, it's really just the highlands that were in clouds, where we're in shade. Yeah, a lot of that stuff was in sun, if I remember right, pretty much. Yeah. So now I think just to keep it pretty local, let's look at Damon's. Damon sent his track in, and it was really good track, and he sent a write up too, and.
Just go probably to the search bar over by you. Oh, you got it still stored in there.
Hong Kong? No, that's not me. So we'll look at it 16 times. And Damon, if you want to just throw in anything, one thing about dioramas, obviously we can't see the clouds or cloud base or anything like that.
Yet. I'm sure they're working on that.
So, first thermal, nicely stacked circles, right? Good climb rate. It's working really well.
Could you click that stats so you can see the climb rate?
Oh yeah, thank you. And one thing I noticed here is that Damon very quickly noticed, you see how like this part of the turn right here, he's not going up anymore? You guys kind of see how that's pretty flat? And he noticed that quickly, right? It's actually pretty impressive, right? Sometimes you'll see pilots like do one turn and go down, which I think one turn going down where you were just going up is human, right? We might have to experiment with one turn, but if you do 2 turns going down where you were just going up, you wasted altitude searching the same place where you knew it wasn't working, right? But Damon kind of felt this area right here of not going up He's like, oh, let's continue out. I got some altitude in the house thermal. Let's continue. Good thing to do. And then right there, it looks like he started going up again. And yeah. Found again, which was a little bit, maybe, if the wind was this way, it could have been a little upwind. There, that was. So, there, once again, no offense to David, but his turns got less than circular. Right? He did find lift, turns got less than circular, mental mapping went out the window, and it was hard to tell where you were. And then right there, that's another lift, but not really circular business, right? So, you see how like he was going up for a ways there, and the circle right there would have worked, but then the circle ended up being kind of right there. And you know, it's just, we all do this sort of thing, but remember, if we stack the circles on top of each other, if we're doing nice circles, our mental mapping's good. And usually if you guys look at your Averys, you'll see times where you've done a few circles and you're going up really nice, and then you'll still be going up and you'll kind of do something other than a circle and you'll lose it, right? And you'll have to go find another climb. And that's usually when we lose it, when we're doing something other than nice circles. It's really hard to mentally map thermals if we're not doing circles. Just going to speed up for a little while here. Nice searching, nice searching. There we go. Whoa. Nice circles. Kind of going up really nice there, right? But then didn't put the circle in there, right? And this, no offense to Damon, I think if we looked at any of our tracks, we'd see this. And very few of you sent me tracks. So. Thank you, David.
Maybe because they don't look that good.
But yeah, we gotta look at those circles, right? Boom! Beautiful stacked circles. And he may have left there. I suspect that was cloud-based or something.
It was 3. It was just enough.
Yeah. And here's one other thing. A lot of people ask me when we're talking about a site like, hey Mitch, how high do you get at the North Ridge before you go to Issaquah? And my answer is, well, cloud-based, you know? How high do you get in your first thermal above the mountain before you go to the North Ridge? Well, as high as I can, right? So, like 3,000, yeah, 3,000 is usually enough to get to the North Ridge, but that was probably 800 feet a minute right there, right? Leaving that is like, you know, it's the equivalent to like throwing money in a parking lot and just walking away, right? It's like, that's your fuel right there, right? It's the equivalent to like draining your fuel tank and not going anywhere in your car, right? That's your fuel right there. Why not take a few more turns? Because you might get to the North Ridge and not find anything. Or you might not quite have the altitude to get to the North Ridge. So he found sink and came back, right? Look, that was some pretty hard sink there. And came back, and then look, found the same thermal he was in. Just about, right? Pretty similar thermal. Came back. And maybe you were doing that drill where you leave the thermal and come back to it.
It was not intentional, but I ended up needing it.
Yeah. And yeah, so especially with the first thermals of the day, guys, take them to the top. Right? I said don't do more than one circle going down, but if you're going up, it's the first thermal of the day, take it to the top. Unless you're, you know, don't go into Class B airspace. Another nice one, nice circles. Sweet, look at that. That's a good climb rate. It was strong.
Class B is 5,000, right?
5,000. And if you get to close to 5,000, you can go closer to the towers, and the Class B steps up to 6. Okay. Yeah, it's really like maybe 300 meters behind takeoff. It steps up to 6. So.
What are the 3 pluses by the glide ratio mean?
What's that?
Oh, either dashes points or 3 pluses points.
So
yeah.
dashes that usually means he's going up, so there's no glide ratio. And then if it says like 10, it means 10 to 1 glide ratio. So 10 feet for every 1 foot. Every 1 foot span altitude, 10 feet forward. But usually when it goes to dashes, that means he's in a climb. And his climb, or not in anything, right? Look, his climb rate's nothing. So let's look at the way from the North Ridge. he did kind of push to the front of Issaquah Highlands, right? So that was pretty well done. This would be his thermal over the North Ridge. And instead of pushing straight across, he kind of pushed to the front and then came back into the terrain. So he did a little bit of a horseshoe there. And searched over the Highlands and then landed. Nice. Good flight. Yeah. And you know what? One really nice thing for those of you who haven't been over there, obviously we want to get really nice and high before going over there, but there's a number of really big fields here in the Highlands that are all bigger and easier than our landing field here, right? There's a number of big fields. Obviously from the area you want to scout them out. There's fences like here, maybe there's a fence. They've maybe changed a little bit since I've been there, but nice big fields over there, right?
It's easier.
It's easier, yeah, totally. And you know, you got a Safeway right here. You can go get a cold beer, and
Who does that?
And a friend might come pick you up, or you might, you know, it's actually like a 20-minute walk back to the LZ or something. It's not bad.
From there?
Well, maybe more than 20
Or 3 hours from
Or,
me.
you know, if you're Ubering it's super fast, a friend might pick you up, whatever. So, that's a pretty nice flight, and it's an interesting kind of like big XC move because you're crossing the I-90 corridor, you're making a big crossing, and let's say first you wouldn't really want to make that move if you thought you weren't going to get there at least high enough to make these LZs, and you'd want to get there plenty high. Like he arrived over the Highlands. Let's say right there is arriving, maybe right there is arriving over the Highlands, 2,700. So way high. What do you think? That landing zone might be at 600 feet. Yeah, more than 2,000 feet over the landing zone. So that's plenty high enough to use thermals and to have a nice landing, to scout the landing zone from above and all that stuff. So that was really well done. And let's say he was on this crossing. Once again, he's out front on the crossing, right? So in a really nice place on the crossing, and he made that judgment wrong. He's like, oh darn, I'm not going to make the Highlands, right? Because there's this little ridge right here going up to the Highlands, right? Well, downwind of him, he's got a bunch of different fields, right? Some of you guys might know these fields better than me, but like there's a ball field here, there's school fields here. Remember, this is all downwind, so our glide stretches out when we go downwind. So as soon as you were on that glide, you're like, ooh, I might not make the Highlands. You'd want to look over your shoulder and say, what landing zones do I have? What's my possibilities of getting back to the North Ridge, or maybe even gliding back to the Tiger LZ, right? What's my possibilities of school fields? I don't know about this school, but most school fields are pretty okay with you laying there when school's not in session. We've got COVID going on, so school's not in session. I've never landed in this area, and I'm not really, it might be a little junky, I don't know about it.
Is it where I landed? It's pretty nice, by the hospital there.
By the hospital, yeah. No, this is kind of in the middle, like, this is next to the I-90, there's like this development and stuff going on.
It's like a quarry or something.
Maybe the core, yeah.
It doesn't look good.
Yeah, that's cool. But there's some little fields here, but you know, mostly you want to arrive at the Highlands plenty high, and those fields near the hospital are great. Yeah.
There was like, this is the same day that Mitch posted his flight as well. So we're flying on the same day, and there's a really gnarly cloud you might remember off to the side here to the left. It was lifty there, but it was pretty sketch.
So someone else told me that day, like, hey, I was afraid of the big dark clouds, right? Yeah. What are the dangers with clouds?
Lightning.
Right? Yeah, going inside of them, right? I'd prefer to kind of take the term cloud suck out of our vocabulary, because it's not the cloud's fault. Right? We know that thermals go up into clouds, right? That's why the nice cumulus clouds are there. And we're turning circles in a thermal that has its top at a cloud. And if we stay in that thermal all the way into the cloud, I don't know if we need to blame the cloud, right? I think it's probably our fault, right? It's probably good to take personal responsibility. But if this is a cloud, tip of the pen is me, right, or is any of us, and I'm thermaling up towards the cloud, it's not uncommon for the climb rate to drastically increase as you get closer to the cloud, right? It's also not so uncommon for the climb rate to drastically decrease as you get closer to the cloud, right? And there's some intense physics we don't need to talk about causing that. But and if you on one day you constantly feel the climb rate really increasing as you get close to the cloud, then suspect it's going to continue doing that for the other clouds, right? So as you get close to the cloud here, right, you want to be on the edge of the cloud when you get up to that level, right? Legal is 500 feet below the edge, just to make sure everyone knows I'm promoting being legal, right? But what you don't want to do is get under that cloud right in the middle of it, right? If you're right in the middle of the cloud when you get under it, and you're like, oh darn, you know, I'm seeing the wispies right here, and then you try to leave the cloud, you've got this whole cloud to traverse to get out of it, and you're probably going to go inside the cloud, right? Because you've got a whole thermal to traverse, and you're already right at cloud base, right? So as you get closer to the cloud, work towards the edge. What edge do you think is the better edge to work towards? Upwind. Upwind side, yeah. Because it's easier to mentally map the thermal on the upwind side for all the reasons we talked about last week, right? The upwind side gives us more options, right? If we're traveling upwind and lift, it gives us more options later in our flight. Does that make sense? The upwind side is generally where the better lift is, so we can really use all the lift to get to the edge of the cloud, right? So upwind's a pretty good call. Also, if we're in a mountain environment, generally upwind is away from mountains. So if we kind of called it wrong and we went inside the cloud a little bit, we want to be choosing a direction away from mountains towards big landing zones, right? And in a mountain environment, generally we're flying the windward side of the mountain, therefore upwind is not towards the terrain, it's towards the valley, right? Slightly different depending on where we are. But so you want to be on the edge right there. There's this kind of pretty broad general rule that we want to keep the cloud at least a 45-degree angle to us, the cloud edge at least a 45-degree angle to us, right? So as we get higher, we need to actually go closer and closer to the cloud edge, right? So that we have that escape. It's a pretty general rule, right? If the lift you're in is 2,000 feet a minute lift, you probably want like more like that, right? Because you're going up in a hurry, right? If the lift you're in is 200 feet a minute lift, and you have experience from earlier in the day that as you get closer to the cloud, the lift peters out, it's one of those days, then you can probably go a little bit lower than 45 degrees. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it somewhat depends on the day and the lift you're feeling, but either way, time it so that you have the option of blue if you see these wispies coming here. You want to be right on the edge if you see the wispies coming here, right? And you have option of blue sky when you want it, right? Once again, if you're in, this is your fault, not the cloud's fault. If you ended up right underneath the middle of the cloud when you see the wispies, that's not the cloud sucking you in, that's you flying right into that cloud. If we do this wrong, right, we want to do this right, but if we do this wrong, what do?
Keep a mental picture of where blue sky is.
Boom.
Away from terrain.
Yeah. So if before we get whited out, right, we want to look down at whatever instrument we have, and if you're not flying with some sort of compass or GPS, something that can give you a direction out of that cloud on your flight deck, change that, right? Get something that can give you a direction out of that cloud, right? And even just one of these little ball compasses does great, right? Have it on your flight deck. There's kind of two types of ball compasses. There's the ones where you look at this side of the compass and it's telling you the direction you're heading. And there's kinds where this side tells you the direction you're heading. So know which compass you have, right? Right? But before you go in that cloud, choose the direction that's away from the cloud towards big landing zones. Not towards mountains, not towards Venturis, but away from the cloud towards big, nice landing zones. If it was above Issaquah Highlands, it would probably be towards Lake Sammamish, right? Something like that, right? So choose that side of the cloud, look at that compass, or if it's a GPS, whatever. Some people say, you know, really thick clouds, GPSs might have some fault terrain. I haven't noticed that a ton, but
instruments are hard to see though when you're in a cloud too, right?
A lot of that might depend on your deck angle and stuff. I don't find my instruments hard to see.
Okay.
So, and then you want to fly that direction, right? And you fly that direction by keeping that compass headed, right? And your brain's going to want to play tricks with you, right? In a whiteout with no visual reference at all, you're going to say, I'm not turning. The compass says I'm turning, but I'm not turning. You're turning. The compass says you're turning. You're turning, right? Get it to say south, you got to fly south, or whatever, or east, or west, I mean, or whatever the case may be, right? So trust the compass, fly the compass, and you'll get out of that cloud. We actually have a pretty big advantage. Paragliding in clouds, I'm not encouraging flying in clouds, don't do it, right? This is in case, right? But we have a pretty big advantage because we're our own pendulum. So if we're flying straight, we're under our glider, right? Hang gliders, planes, everything like that can like start to have rules, start to have stuff other than just direction being the thing they're worried about. But as far as paragliding, because we're our own pendulum, we just need to keep a straight line and you'll come out of that cloud, right? How big's a big cloud?
Complete cloud cover.
Yeah, 5 miles might be a big cloud, right? 5 miles is a pretty big cloud, right? So let's say we didn't even get to cloud base in the middle. We got into cloud base on the far side of the cloud, and the direction we chose takes us all the way through the cloud, right? Trim speed, we go, let's say 24 miles an hour, right? So the longest we're going to be in that cloud is, what's that, 15, 20 minutes, right? That's a huge cloud that we entered the wrong side in, right? Most of the time, it'd be more like you're in that cloud for like a minute. It'll feel like a really long time, right? But really, it's not that long time. Your brain's going to want to play tricks on you. You're going to want to say, ooh, maybe I'm going the wrong way. Maybe I should go over here. Or maybe this is the wrong way. Maybe that's how you spend a half hour in there, right? Right? Just choose a direction, go out that direction, log it as a mistake, log it as something you never want to do again, and have a nice rest of your flight.
Aren't you grabbing big ears and then speed bar?
Oh, yeah. Let's go over that in just a second.
With your performance, should we expect to perform differently in that moisture environment?
Really good question. We're going to get, yeah. So let's hit the first question, the big ears and speed bar question, right? Speed bar, yeah, awesome. We're going to eat up that 5 miles quicker with speed bar, right? So as much speed bar as you're willing to use in the turbulence, right, to keep in control and keep going on the heading, awesome. Big ears slows us down at the same speed set. Usually we're not trying to descend out the bottom of a cloud, right? Right? Usually we're trying to get to the edge. The bottom of the cloud has lift, so it's, and if it's strong enough lift that we got sucked into the cloud, it's probably really hard to descend through, right? So our exit's most likely the side of the cloud, not the bottom, right? What we definitely never ever want to do in a cloud is spiral out the bottom, right? Your buddies may have done nothing wrong and just be under that cloud in nice blue sky, and then you come spiraling out of there at whatever speed and smack right into them, right? Don't be spiraling out of clouds. If you go into a cloud, be incredibly predictable, straight line towards a nice direction, right? Don't be spiraling in there. Don't be doing wingovers in there. Don't be stalling your glider in there to descend out. Don't worry about getting out the bottom. Get out the side of the cloud. Be really, predictable. If you go into that cloud with someone else, right? We're trying not to do this stuff. If you go in with someone else, keep the distance so you can see them. Does that make sense? So if you're thermaling with someone else, you're like, yeah, we're thermaling, oh cool, we're at cloud base, and you're in the cloud all of a sudden, probably when you're thermaling, you're close enough to see each other in the cloud. Keep that vision, right? If you're on radio, say, hey, let's head south. Head south, but keep close enough to see each other, because what you don't want to do is get lost and then find each other again, right? Keep close enough to keep an eye on each other. Cool.
I had a question.
Yeah.
You said that this was the same day that Mitch posted, right?
17th, yeah.
And so what this whole cloud thing started was what you said, right? You went off into the highlands because there was big clouds east.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about that day of why we went into the cloud versus the other pilots, maybe you, but it was definitely Meredith that went away into the sun, and what happened to them, what happened to us?
So yeah, totally. Let me go. I'm kind of working through the dangers of cloud and then maybe rain. So what's your name? Don, Mitch. So Don asked about moisture on our glider, right? The real problem with moisture on our glider, especially rain on our glider, is droplets on the top surface, causing turbulence on the top surface, and vastly changing our stall speed, increasing our stall speed, making it much easier to stall the glider, right? So humid type fog moisture, that like we feel like a little moisture on our face, but it's not like droplets, we'll probably does that a little bit, but it's not nearly as bad as like big raindrops on the top of your glider. Does that make sense? Right? But I think you're right, Don. Does some moisture on the top of your glider, does it kind of tend to droplet, and therefore does it create turbulence on the top surface of your glider like icing might on a plane and change the flight characteristics, especially raising stall speed, therefore making it easier to stall? Yeah, it does. So we don't want to fly, we're getting on to dangers of a cloud. We don't want to fly in rain for that reason, right? Because we don't want our glider to stall easier than it normally does, right? If you do fly in rain, once again, we don't want to, but if you do, right, let's say it didn't look like it was going to rain and all of a sudden it starts raining on you and you're flying away from the rain, so you know that, hey, I have some water droplets on the top surface of my glider. If it's appropriate with your altitude and where you are in your comfort level, use some speed bar. Use speed bar pitch control instead of brake pitch control, like we talked about last week, right? Because guess what? Speed bar is taking you further away from stall, right? It's also putting more airflow on the top of that glider, which might resolve the water droplets a little sooner. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Right? If you have to use brakes, let's say you're coming into landing or something, try to be real light on brake pressure. Try to use as much weight shift as possible, light on brake pressure. Don't get deep into those brakes until it's flare. Right? Until you're within a foot of the ground, then get deep in those brakes. And if it stalls a little bit earlier when you're in flare, a foot from the ground, hey, you're still on your feet. It's all there. Does that make sense? So if you are on a glider with water droplets on the top because of moisture or rain, keep your speeds up a little bit. Use a little more speed bar. Be a little more wary about the brakes. Get more turn done with weight shift. We can fly the glider like that, and then we're further away from stall the whole time. Right? If you guys ever are in like a parachutage stall or deep stall, which could be caused by intense raindrops on the top of your glider, or like a lot of sand in the back of gliders has done it sometimes. You're flying at the beach and you don't empty your glider out for a couple days and you have a bunch of sand and it's not really a glider shape anymore. So if you ever find yourself kind of dropping down straight with no wind on your face, that's a parachutal stall, right? You can reach forward and push the A's. Get that glider flying again, right? Get that flying. It does two things, right? Our hands reaching up and out on the A's takes the brakes off, right? And the common thing is people get a little clenched when that happens and they keep brake on, which keeps you in the stall, right? And pushing the A's restarts the glider, gets it to fly again. Another option is pushing the speed bar, which pushes the A's also, gets the glider to restart, but it doesn't have this cool thing of getting the brakes off, right? So either one works. Mostly we don't want brakes on if our glider's stalling out of the air. And the only times it happens, right, it doesn't happen with good equipment and good condition, right? It happens with really porous gliders, right? So really old gliders, if you can breathe through a glider easily, it's time to trash the glider or use it for ground handling only or something. There's also porosity where we can get a more scientific thing than just breathing through it. Or lots of sand or debris in the trailing edge, right? And we're talking a lot. We're talking weight in the trailing edge, or a whole lot of water droplets on the top surface. Okay? And even the water droplets, oh yeah, let's leave it at that. So, dangers of clouds, going into them, right? We talked about how to mitigate that, right? That day there wasn't rain anywhere, right? No sign of rain, and actually like not much vertical development to the clouds, so I wouldn't have really predicted rain that day, right? There were some big dark clouds, but I wouldn't really predict rain that day, right? The third thing, which comes along with the rain, is gust fronts, right? When rain and hail and all that stuff come out from a cloud, it represents cold air coming down from the cloud, right? And then a certain amount of evaporation is always happening when rain comes out of a cloud. Evaporation causes cooling also, evaporative cooling, right? So that's more cold air that's going to want to rapidly sink down. Does that make sense? Virga, we probably know what it is, right? It's like when rain starts to come out of a cloud, but it doesn't make it all the way to the ground. It evaporates before it makes it to the ground. right? That cold air is still represented in Virgo, right? Because the rain is still coming out of the cloud, the evaporation is still coming out of the cloud, all that stuff is still going on, right? So this cold air, rain, hail, all that stuff, coming out of the cloud and rapidly descending, because cold air wants to rapidly descend down through warmer air. That part is called a microburst, right? And like 777s don't like to fly in microbursts, right? At some of these airports in the Midwest where they have like big, tall thunderstorms, they have microburst sensors, right? So they'll sense when a thunderstorm is, and they'll be able to like time it by this, because they're trying to get a bunch of jets to land in this short amount of time, and they'll say, oh, microburst, okay, everyone go around, deviate to another airport, our microburst alert went off, right? So, and there was a famous United flight that crashed in one of those Midwest airports because of a microburst, and that's when they created this whole microburst alerting system. Yeah. Microburst, bad, right? We don't want to fly. When a thunderstorm starts to spit out all that rain and hail, we don't want to be flying under it. Good reason not to fly when there's big towering cumulonimbus around, right? Thunderstorm just doesn't come out of nowhere. It's those days where you see the clouds grow taller and taller and taller and wider and wider and wider. That's when thunderstorms develop, right? So a good rule is you don't want to be flying on a day where the clouds are taller than they are wide, right? Think Marge Simpson hairdo, right? If the lapse rate and dew point have the ability to call, and next time we meet, we're going to do weather. So we'll kind of talk through this a little more. We'll talk through weather forecasting, lapse rate and dew point, and all that stuff. But if the lapse rate and dew point have the ability for clouds to grow really tall, right? So if you're up on takeoff at noon and you're seeing just like Marge Simpson hairdos all over the place, well, just a little more energy in that system, and we got cumulonimbus and thunderstorms, right? And more energy is just the sun continuing to do its thing for the rest of the day, right? So it's a pretty good basic rule to make sure you're never going to fly in a microburst thunderstorm is, hey, if the clouds are growing taller than they are wide, I'm going to stay on the ground. If I'm in the air when that starts to happen, I'm going to go find a landing, right? You'll be on the ground well before thunderstorms. Does that make sense? You'll have some days where the clouds grow tall, and then like the lower cloud base rises to the top and they get nice again. And you would have landed. And hey, we want to be on the safe side of that stuff, right? So on those days when that happens, don't kick yourself. Oh, people are still flying. I could still be up there. And Mitch said no Marge Simpson here. Damn it. But you know, no, right. We want to be on the safe side of that line. Cool. So rain, cold air rapidly descends, microbursts, right? Then when it gets to the ground, what do you think it wants to do? Yeah, it wants to rapidly expand underneath all that warmer air, right? Yeah, sure, there's going to be terrain flows that likes to expand faster through, terrain features that it needs to go around, so that sort of stuff. But in general, it just wants to expand underneath that warmer air. As that's happening, it's going to force a bunch of that warmer air up. Does that make sense? And in somewhat of a turbulent way a lot of times. Force all that warmer air up, and it's going to continue to do that until it's matched the temperature of that warm air. Then it can't expand under it, and it doesn't have the power to expand under it, and it's not going to force it up anymore, right? And in a place like the Mojave Desert, that could take 40, 50 miles, right? A gust front could go for 40, 50 miles in the Mojave Desert or in Idaho. I won't tell you. But yeah, in some places that can go for a very long time. In sailplanes, you might use them sometimes, huh?
Fixed wings take 20 miles away from them.
Yeah, exactly. Fixed wings, thunderstorm. It's like an FAA regulation, stay 20 miles away from thunderstorms, right? For aircraft. So it's a serious deal. You don't want to fly in gust fronts. Let's say you made some mistakes, right? Let's say you're flying and you see a bunch of rain and hail coming out over here, right? Now, if I'm 5,000 feet over the ground, should I just descend as fast as I can?
Fly away from them.
Fly away from it, right? Use that altitude to get away, because remember, it's losing energy the further it gets away from that thunderstorm, right? I've seen people do this wrong. I was at a PWC in Turkey, Paragliding World Cup in Turkey, and they called the task because of rain and hail, thunderstorm, and it was in the deserts of Turkey, like a place where thunderstorms can be gust fronts can be powerful, and everyone just started descending down into the gust front, and I didn't. I flew 30 miles further and landed in nice air, but I was watching people get dragged across the desert, and like 2 guys ruined their glider. There was blood all over legs. Everyone was mostly okay, but it was like, you guys are PWC, but why would you send it into Gus Friends here, right? They called the test, but we have altitude. Let's go 20 miles this way and like just land nice. Anyway, so yeah, if you just start descending, you're like, I want to get out of the air now. Well, you start descending. Remember, there's this wedge of lifting air. It's going to be really hard to descend through that wedge of lifting air, right? Oh, it's going to be really, really hard to descend, right? And then if you're successful at descending, you get to the ground right around this moment where a strong gust front could be 50 miles an hour gust front, right? A strong one can be 50 miles an hour. Now, here on the west side, pretty rare, right? On the east side of Chelan, not very rare, right? Over there, 50 mile an hour gust fronts happen, right? So you could like be near the ground right as all this, it's not just one line of wind, right? It's all this action happening in front of the wind. Lots of turbulence, lots of lifting air, some descending air out in front of it here because that lifting air might come back over, right? Lots of stuff going on. You don't want to be messing with the ground there. If you've got 5,000 feet and you start to see it rain over there, as long as there are good landing zones over there, man, just use that 5,000 feet this way. We're on paragliders. We descend in a straight line. You need to get as far out in front of that as you can and go have a nice landing, right? Don't force it down in the turmoil right here. Does that make sense? Yeah. So we don't want to make those mistakes, but if you do, if you weren't looking around, or if you thought, oh, you know, they're kind of tall clouds, but I don't think it's going to thunderstorm today. I looked at the Weather Channel and they only gave it a 10% chance. No, you know, if you see a thunderstorm, use your altitude away from it.
Well, if you don't have that much altitude, you have to land, right?
Then yeah, exactly. You have to land when the ground comes. Yeah.
Any tips or pointers to landing in something like that?
Straight and level.
Right.
It's a pretty good rule for landing in turbulence and wind in general, right? Straight and level, right? What we don't want to, on a paraglider, if we're going straight and level, all of our speeds are pretty low, right? If we're going straight and level and we don't flare, we don't actually hit the ground that hard, right? We hit the ground pretty softly, right? And if we flare, we hit the ground very softly. But if we're doing turns, we add all this swinging motion and we can get some pretty big energies going on, right? And if we're doing turns and something happens, like we take a low collapse because it's turbulent, then we have all this swing, right? If we're going straight and level and it's turbulence and we don't control our glider just right and we take a collapse, we know it from SIV and stuff, it stays mostly straight and level, right? But if you're in this big turn that happens, you know, like there's a lot of energies going on there. So a good rule in general with landing in turbulent wind is make sure you're straight and level from at least 30 feet up, and the more turbulent, the higher, right? And guess what? Straight and level into blackberry bushes, straight and level into a lot of things is better than big turns just so you can land on the nice grass, right? Does that make sense? Cool. Mark?
To his point about landing in turbulent conditions, when you're committed, say, to landing at the Tiger landing field, and there you are at 2,000 feet, and the radio call comes up, hey, it's a toilet bowl down here, land. It's probably a mistaken piece of advice. I'll suggest that the turbulent air gust front that comes through momentary generally lasts about 20 minutes. And the sage advice would be to hang out up there and try to get an extra 30 minutes or more until that's passed through and subsided.
Yeah, good point. And that's exactly what a lot of you have done many evenings, right? Is it's nice to launch, to fly around the glass off for a while, and to wait for that shadow line to pass over the LZ for a nice smooth landing, right? That's like the norm here, and it's a great norm to have, right? And there's nothing wrong with staying in the air until the conditions are nicer on the ground. Remember, our riskiest times are when we're near the ground, takeoff and landing, right? So, in my view, a lot of pilots have made mistakes here and there trying to descend and land because they don't like the air. And guess where you don't like the air the most? Right next to the ground, right? And especially if it's a 20-minute event and there's plenty of lift up here, and you're not feeling it, it's just like, hey, hang out 20 minutes. Let that push of wind come through, and then get down. Yeah.
When you're experiencing a turbulent area, let's say 2,000 feet or something, and it starts to subside, is there any type of lag in what would be going on at the landing zone? Or is it, if it's calm, all of a sudden you're probably good to go?
I'd say like something like 2,000 feet, you could have a totally different situation in the landing than you have up there near takeoff. Would you agree with that, Mark? It can be a lot different. So sometimes at takeoff, beautiful, nice thermals, and literally come into the bottom 300 feet or so, and then it's eroded. 2 days ago, I think it was a little bit like that, huh? Where like we had a couple flights where it's pretty nice flying up there, all good, and then we come down near the landing, and it's like, you know, it's pretty full on, yeah. Cool. We've gone pretty long. I wanted to talk about one more thing that's somewhat homework for the week. So we talked about like these kind of pilot oscillation drills, right? Getting the glider to kind of swing back and forth a little bit and roll, pitch, and yaw, right? Not wing overs, but kind of getting some swing back and forth, and then going back to straight and level flight. Somewhat like those pitch drills, but just adding things to them, right? The other thing to do is harness configuration, right? So I've noticed my harnesses, my body changes from 1 month to the next. Those harness straps, there's probably some shrinkage and expansion that goes on in some of those harness straps. It's not unusual for one of the straps to get pulled on takeoff or on landing, or when you're loading a bag or unloading a bag or whatever. So if you haven't been in a simulator in your harness for a while, get in a simulator, hang your harness up here somewhere, and dial your harness in, right? You might find that you're actually leaning one way a little bit more than the other because just one strap here is loose, something like that, right? So dial your harness in, make sure you're comfortable in it. It's kind of a hard thing to tell when we're in moving air, when we're flying, when our mind's occupied with all this stuff. It's much easier to get it dialed in here, right? And then there's this thing called the ventral setting on harnesses. So it's a pretty important setting. It defines the distance between our carabiners. I'll just grab it. Okay, you guys know. It defines the distance between our carabiners. So where are risers attached to the carabiners? Top of the carabiners, right? Where are risers attached to the carabiners? There's a very specific distance there that they tested your glider with, right? When they did the European Union testing with your glider, and they did all those maneuvers and stuff, they had a very specific distance between those carabiners, and it has to do with this big strap here. You know, the big one that some of us have buckles on it. Sometimes it's kind of integrated into leg buckles. But that big strap right here, there's an adjustment on there, and that defines this distance between the carabiners, okay? You never want that distance to be narrower than the distance they tested the harness under, right? Sorry, the glider under, right? So you can look up your glider manufacturer may list the recommended distance, or the European Union test report for your glider will list the distance the test pilot had their harness set to.
What's the name for it again?
Yeah, what is it, just riser spread distance?
I think they call it ventral setting.
Ventral setting.
VENTRAL. If I remember right, on the test report, it's near the top of the test report, and it'll tell you the harness they're in and the ventral setting of that harness when they tested the glider. So either find it recommended by your manufacturer. It's different with different sizes, right? So typically a small glider will be like 41 or 42 centimeters, and a large will be like 48, sometimes even 50 centimeters, right? But look for your own, right? Get in a simulator and figure out what setting you have, right? And also measure it like on your fingers to elbow. That way when you're flying, you can put your arm right there and just check, right? Obviously it's somewhat of a approximate measurement, but you have the measurement then anytime you want it, right? So check that, measure it. You never want it narrower than their recommendations. Why?
Riser twist.
Riser twist, exactly. You know, like when we were kids, if you wanted to twist the swing set around a bunch, you held these 2 points closer and you were able to twist it. And if you wanted to untwist it, you held them apart and it untwisted, right? Same thing with our harnesses, right? If those 2 points come in too close, then our body is less connected to the glider because we're trending towards one hang point.
right? So the glider can shoot, and our body might shoot the other way, and we get twists easier, right? If they're wide, we got 2 hang points more, and we're probably gonna roll around with the glider more, right? So wider than those manufacturer recommendations can be uncomfortable, especially in turbulent air, because you get thrown around quite a bit more. You feel the glider a lot more. You feel these asymmetric actions from the glider more because 2 hang points further apart, right? When it's wider, it's not really such a danger thing because you're getting further and further from the chance of having twists, right? Also wider, weight shift is in the same boat, right? And too narrow, and your weight shift isn't going to have as much effect as wider, right? So you don't want it narrower than those manufacturer recommendations. And for me, on a shady, light thermal day where I want maximum feeling from my glider, I'll open it up. I'll go wide, right? So I just get maximum sensitivity. My weight shift works a lot, so I don't have to use as much brakes, and I can really feel those thermals out. But I'll never go narrower than their recommendation. Yeah. So that's another piece of homework for this. I'm actually not going to be here next week. I have to help my mom with something. So I have to help my mom fly a plane across the country, which I'm pretty pumped. We'll get. I think the next Saturday will be good. So we'll get in contact about the next Saturday. Maybe we can get a speaker here next week. We'll see. Those are your kind of 2 pieces of homework. Continue on the pitch drill we talked about. Continue on all the stuff we talked about. Thermal drills we have, right? If there's just one house thermal, or you got to go to work soon or whatever, and you just want to stay right here practicing one house thermal, we know what to do. And we have those drills for coming out with lots of air under you in a good box, and doing the pitch drills and now the roll drills too. And work on that harness and make sure your harness is dialed in. And then kind of, it's not a bad idea once a month or so to hang the simulator in your harness and just dial it all in again. Because guess what? Things change. Right? I've noticed that like every time I hang a simulator in my harness, there's things to adjust. Even though I did it a month ago and adjusted things. Yeah. Cool. Perfect. Thanks for being here, guys.
Thanks.